Dr. Barna, I want to dive right into biblical worldview because some of these numbers, and we've talked about them in the past, they are alarming. And you, better than anyone, you know these stats. One of them is that 2% of parents today possess a biblical worldview. Before we get into how depressing that sounds, what exactly is a biblical worldview?
Well, everybody has a worldview, Billy. It's basically the intellectual, moral, spiritual filter that each of us uses to make every decision that we make. So to make decisions, you have to have a worldview. It's the thing that makes sense of the world for you and your place within it. So when we talk about a biblical worldview, what that means is that as you make your decisions, what you're doing is going back to basic biblical principles, trying to understand what's God's perspective on the various situations I might encounter. What kind of decisions could I make that would honor him, that would be in harmony with his principles? And that's why it's important for Christians to know the scriptures so that as we make those decisions, we're consistent with what God's calling us to do and to be and how to live.
Yeah, I've noticed that people sometimes scoff, especially in the secular world, at this idea of worldview. You know, I've been in many conversations where that will happen. And it's interesting because, to your point, every single person, every human being has a worldview. There's not just a Christian worldview. There are all sorts of worldviews out there. But how, from a Christian perspective, how does a culture end up in a situation where only 2% of parents have a biblical worldview? I mean, that seems almost unimaginable.
Well, and it really raises a bigger issue, Billy, which is how many individuals in America are actually disciples of Jesus? Because it's the people who get discipled who tend to have a biblical worldview. Somebody loved them enough, cared about them enough to spend time with them, reading the scriptures, studying the scriptures, discussing the scriptures, applying the scriptures. That's really what brings somebody around to become a disciple. It's not just about attending church. It's not just about owning and reading a Bible. It's about wanting to be as Christ-like as possible. And so we know that because you do what you believe, your beliefs matter a lot. They determine what your lifestyle is going to be. And it's through your lifestyle that you prove whether or not you're a disciple. Simply having some biblical beliefs doesn't do it. You know, you can read in the scriptures where even Satan believes in God. He knows that God exists. He knows that God is powerful. He knows that God is all-knowing. So that's not necessarily the thing. Where you turn the corner is when you take those beliefs and you convert them into action. And so the reason that we have so few parents with a biblical worldview is that they were never really discipled when they were young. And so when you get several consecutive generations where the number of discipled young people has been dropping precipitously, as has happened in America over the last 40 years, that's when you get the situation that we've got today, where more and more adults are convinced it doesn't matter what faith you believe as long as you have some faith. And that's something that 2/3 of Americans believe. You know, it doesn't really matter whether you're trying to become Christ-like as long as you're a good person. That's something that more than 2/3 of Americans believe. So it's these kinds of secularized perspectives where we've sanded the edges off Christian truth to make it more palatable and more comfortable. And then we buy into those philosophies, and then those kind of work their way into secular humanism and postmodernism and Marxism, Eastern mysticism, all the other beliefs, because we bought into this idea it really doesn't matter what you believe as long as you really believe it. That's your truth, and that's all that matters.
Well, and you hit on a number of huge topics there. I mean, you have a book out too, which I want to talk about in a moment, Raising Spiritual Champions, Nurturing Your Child's Heart, Mind, and Soul. And obviously that book title, what you just said, it indicates that worldview is something that is rooted and that takes form very early on. And I've heard you talk about this. We've spoken about it in the past, but help people understand, when does worldview start to develop, and what is sort of the window in which young people need to be reached in order to instill a Christian worldview?
Yeah, and so part of the reason why our discussion here about parents is so important is because, first of all, parents have the God-given responsibility to raise kids up, to know, love, and serve God with all their heart, mind, strength, and soul. That's their primary responsibility in life. And so when we talk about, well, why would we focus on children? Why wouldn't we wait till they're teenagers, or better yet, college students, or best of all, when they're young adults? Because then they can really think, well, it's too late. Because you start making decisions at 15 to 18 months of age. That's when your worldview begins to form. And by the age of 13, you've typically confronted all the major questions in life. Who am I? Why am I here? What is life about? What does success look like? All of these kinds of issues and more. And so by the age of 13, you've developed a full world view. Now, for most young people in America today, it won't be a biblical worldview, because nobody's coming alongside of them and say, wait. Before you make that decision, let's look at the options and the implications of those alternatives, where they're coming from, what they mean, what they're going to do to who you are as a person. And so between that 15-month and 13-year age range is the most critical time in a person's life, because it determines who they're going to be for the rest of their life. We found there are 4 phases of worldview. The first one is that developmental phase up to the age of 13. During the teens through mid to late 20s is a time when we take that worldview and we refine it. We figure out how to articulate it. During our 30s through mid to late 60s is a time when we become evangelists. Sadly, most of us don't evangelize for Jesus. We're evangelizing for our personal worldview. We want other people to believe and do the same things we do. It makes us feel good. And then in our late 60s and later is when we look back and think, did I get it right? And that's a time when many of us are grandparents and we're trying now to help our grandchildren. We want them to get it right. So that first developmental phase up through the age of 13 is the most critical.
So I'm going to say something, and you can push back because it might be too harsh, but based on the data and what you're saying, it feels like most parents and most Christian parents are actually failing their kids in the most important area imaginable. Would that be a fair statement, or is it too harsh?
It's fair, but we also have to understand that it's unintentional. Most parents love their kids. They want to do what's right for their kids. And so as they look at their life, because they're distracted, they're deceived, they're awfully busy, they look at their kids and they say, well, I'll do the best I can for them. I'll outsource parenting. And so what they do is they go out and they hire the best people they can find to raise them up in the different dimensions of life. So they hire coaches, they hire tutors, they hire mentors, spiritual mentors, all these different kind of people, again, almost none of whom have a biblical worldview. So even the people that the parents have deputized to take over the role of parent, or at least to strongly support them in that parenting process, they're not going to lead their kids to a biblical worldview. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that our parents are failing as disciples in most parts. And what they're doing in turn is they're setting up their children to fail as disciples as well. Even though they mean well, they're really not getting the job done.
Yeah, I love that. I love how you explain that, right? We know that most parents obviously love their kids, and I think you really astutely framed that, because it is, you look at it, and I'm busy. I have an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old, and you think through the different things you try to do. And I have some, scheduling abilities that allow me to be able to do, Bible study with them in the morning and at night. And I think some people, it's hard to do those things. Not that I'm doing everything I can, but trying to have that plan, that spiritual development plan. And that was one of the data points before we shift to the book here that I wanted to ask you about. What percentage of parents and or Christian parents actually have, a spiritual development plan in place for their kids?
Yeah, we're talking in the single digits, Phil. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing because when you look at parents, what we find is that most of them have a plan for their kids. They want them to do well in school. They want them to be healthy. They want them to develop good friends. They've got all these different ideas about what's going to help their child to succeed. But you see, again, you go back to discipleship. Their parents aren't disciples, so their idea about success has nothing to do with their faith. It's all about their earning power, their educational achievement, their prestige in the marketplace, the community they live in, all those things they're preparing their kids for. So we're talking about actually less than 10% of Christian parents, born-again Christians,
Wow.
who are parents today of kids under 13, who have any kind of spiritual development plan for their kids.
That is alarming. And it's a call for prayer, I think, to all of us, too, as Christians, to be out there praying for the parents around us, obviously praying for our own kids, and making sure that we have those very basic tenets in place, and not putting other things before our spiritual development of our kids. When it comes to the book, Raising Spiritual Champions, what are you hoping readers take away? How can this be a helpful tool to all of us?
I don't want this to seem mean, but I'm hoping it's a slap in the face to most parents. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to be doing this. I have to do that. I don't even know how to do it. Okay, good. Then let's get on track. It's like you can't fix what you don't understand is broken. And so I'm hoping here to help parents understand maybe your parenting practices are broken. Maybe we need to rethink those. Your goals for your children, your approach, your commitment levels, how you measure what's going on. You get what you measure. And what we find is that most parents are not measuring anything related to the spiritual lives of their children. Again, they're measuring their athletic exploits. What's your batting average, your points per game? They're measuring their performance in the classroom. What's your GPA? But they're not measuring how are you doing in terms of your relationship with Jesus? How are you doing in terms of your commitment to becoming Christ-like? And so rethinking so many of these attributes, and a lot of parents say, well, but the book talks so much about how one of the hallmarks of a disciple of Jesus is that they try to think like him. In other words, they have a biblical worldview. And I, as their parent, don't even have a biblical worldview. What am I going to do? Listen, you only need to be about 10 seconds ahead of your kids, okay? You don't need to have figured it all out. You just need to be running down that track as fast as you can and make sure that, you're in front of your kids. It's like, how do you get away from a bear? You run faster than the person between you and the bear. And so it's very much like that. So you can do this. You don't have to have everything figured out. You don't have to be perfect in terms of your worldview, but you got to perfectly be committed to working at it and to then modeling everything that you're learning for your kids.
That is so true. And the book is Raising Spiritual Champions. Dr. Barna, I appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much, Billy.